You're running through the Australian bush, heart pounding, lungs burning. Behind you, something's crashing through the undergrowth, something that shouldn't exist. You stumble, fall, scramble behind a tree. That's when you see it. 23 feet of muscle and scales, teeth like steak knives. And it's not a crocodile. It's not in the water. It's walking, on land, heading straight for you. This isn't a movie. This isn't Jurassic Park. This actually happened. 65,000 years ago, the first humans to reach Australia didn't find an empty continent. They found a nightmare factory where evolution had spent 50 million years asking one question: how scary can we make this? The answer? A venomous lizard the size of a school bus, a marsupial with bolt cutters for teeth that drop from trees like a 300-pound guillotine, and a crocodile, yes, a crocodile that decided swimming was for losers and evolved to sprint across dry land. I'm about to show you an Australia that makes today's deadly wildlife look like a petting zoo. A time when humans weren't the apex predators, we were the menu. And for 20,000 years, that's 4 times longer than all of recorded human history, our ancestors woke up every single morning in a world where everything, and I mean everything, was designed to kill them. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. We won. Those giants, gone. Those monsters, extinct. Every impossible predator that ruled this continent for millions of years, dead. How did naked apes with pointy sticks defeat dragons? Buckle up, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about human survival. This is the story they don't teach in schools. The time when nightmares were real, when giants walked the earth, and when our ancestors faced them with nothing but fire, stone tools, and the kind of stubborn determination that makes us the most dangerous species this planet has ever seen. Welcome to Prehistoric, Australia, where evolution went completely insane, and where humans did the impossible. Picture this. It's 65 million years ago. The asteroid that killed the dinosaurs has just turned Earth into a smoking crater. But on a massive island continent in the southern hemisphere, something different is happening. Australia, already isolated from the rest of the world, is about to become evolution's private laboratory. And the experiments it's about to run, they're going to make Jurassic Park look like a petting zoo. See, when that space rock hit Mexico, Australia was already its own world. It had broken away from Antarctica 85 million years ago and was drifting north like a massive life raft, carrying its own unique cargo of creatures. No land bridges, no invasions from other continents, just millions of years of complete isolation where evolution could go completely insane. The dinosaurs here weren't your typical T-Rex knockoffs. Australia had Australorvinator, a 20-foot nightmare with claws like meat hooks that could run 30 miles per hour. In the southern forests, Leelinosaura had evolved enormous eyes to see in the polar darkness, hunting in conditions that would have killed other dinosaurs. But then came the impact, the fires, the darkness, the death. Here's where Australia's story gets interesting. While the rest of the world was basically starting from scratch, Australia's isolation meant some creatures survived that shouldn't have. In hidden pockets of rainforest, in cave systems, in the vast interior deserts, life found a way. Not dinosaur life, they were done, but something else, something that would eventually become even more terrifying. The first mammals in Australia weren't much to look at. Think of a shrew crossed with a rat, hiding in the underbrush, coming out at night to nibble on insects. But with the dinosaurs gone, these little furballs had the entire continent to themselves. And over the next 65 million years, they would evolve into creatures that make your worst nightmares look pleasant. Because here's the thing about island evolution, it doesn't follow the rules. Animals get bigger, or smaller, or weirder. It's called Foster's Rule, and Australia took it to extremes nobody could have predicted. Combine that with a climate that swung between tropical paradise and frozen wasteland, and you've got the perfect recipe for creating monsters. By 30 million years ago, the transformation was complete. The age of Australian dinosaurs was over. The age of marsupial terror was about to begin. You know how people say everything's bigger in Texas? Well, 50,000 years ago in Australia, everything was bigger, period. And nothing exemplified this more than Megalania, a name that literally means great roamer. But calling it a roamer is like calling a great white shark a fish. Technically true, but it misses the pants-wetting terror of the thing. Megalania was a monitor lizard, you know, like those little guys you see in pet stores. Except this one was 23 feet long, weighed as much as a small car, and had a mouth full of serrated teeth backed by venom glands. Oh, did I mention the venom? Because of course the largest terrestrial lizard ever discovered was also venomous. This is Australia we're talking about. The first Aboriginal Australians who encountered Megalania must have thought they'd walked into hell. Here's this massive lizard, bigger than a saltwater crocodile, and it's not confined to the water. It's stalking through the bush, climbing trees despite weighing 1,300 pounds. And it's smart. Monitor lizards today are problem solvers. They can count. They remember faces. Now imagine one the size of a truck with that kind of intelligence. Recent fossil evidence from Queensland tells us exactly how these monsters hunted. They were ambush predators, but not the sit and wait kind. They actively stalked prey, using their forked tongues to track scent trails for miles. Those tongues could taste the air, creating a 3D map of smells that led them straight to their victims. The killing method was pure nightmare fuel. Unlike snakes that swallow prey whole, Megalania had a different strategy. Those serrated teeth would saw through flesh like a chainsaw, while venom, similar to what Komodo dragons use today, prevented blood from clotting. One bite, and you're bleeding out while being tracked by a monster that can smell your blood from a mile away. But here's what really makes your skin crawl. They were everywhere. Fossil sites from Western Australia to Queensland show these dragons ruled the entire continent. They hunted giant wombats in the south, stalked kangaroos in the deserts, and terrorized anything that moved. For 2 million years, Megalania was the undisputed king of Australian predators. Aboriginal stories still speak of the giant goanna, passed down for 50,000 years. Think about that. A creature so terrifying that its memory survived 500 centuries of oral tradition. These weren't myths or legends. They were warnings. If I told you that koalas had a cousin that was Australia's most efficient killing machine, you'd think I was crazy. But that's exactly what Thylacoleo carnifex was. A cuddly herbivore's relative that evolution transformed into pure murder. And the way it did, it will haunt your dreams forever. Picture this. You're walking through ancient Australian forest 100,000 years ago. The trees are massive, the undergrowth thick. You hear something above you, maybe a bird. You look up just in time to see 300 pounds of muscle and teeth dropping straight toward your face. Welcome to the world of the marsupial lion, the only predator in history that killed by falling on things. See, Thylacoleo broke every rule about how predators should work. Lions chase, tigers stalk, bears overpower. But the marsupial lion, it was a drop bear that wasn't a joke. Those massive forearms weren't for running, they were for climbing. That rigid spine that made it terrible at pursuit. Perfect for maintaining balance on tree branches. Those weird thumb claws that extended 5 inches. Ideal for gripping bark. and disemboweling prey. The bite force is what really gets paleontologists excited. Pound for pound, Thylacoleo had the strongest bite of any mammalian predator ever, not just extinct ones. Any predator. A 300-pound marsupial lion could bite harder than an 800-pound grizzly bear. Its skull was basically a biological hydraulic press with fur. But here's where it gets weird. Those teeth weren't normal carnivore teeth. No canines for gripping, no rows of sharp points. Instead, it had these massive bolt-cutter premolars that could shear through bone like scissors through paper. One bite could sever a spine. One bite could remove a limb. One bite was all it needed. The fossil evidence from Naracoorte caves shows us exactly how they lived. Scratch marks 15 feet up cave walls. Juvenile bones in impossible places. These weren't ground-dwelling cats. They were arboreal assassins that turned Australia's forests into three-dimensional killing fields. Aboriginal Dreamtime stories tell of the drop bear that would fall from trees and attack people. Modern Australians turned it into a joke to scare tourists. But 50,000 years ago, it wasn't funny. It was a real creature that could climb 50 feet up a tree, wait perfectly still for hours, then drop onto prey with those switchblade thumbs extended and those bolt-cutter jaws already opening for the killing bite. For 2 million years, nothing was safe under Australian trees. Then humans arrived and changed the game forever. Every human culture has a primal fear of crocodiles. It's hardwired into our DNA. Stay away from the water's edge. Watch for those eyes. Run if you see one. But what if I told you there was a time in Australia when running from a crocodile would have been the worst possible decision? Because 50,000 years ago, Australian crocodiles could run faster than you. Meet Quinkana, the terrestrial crocodile. While its relatives were perfecting the art of aquatic ambush, Quinkana decided to become a land predator. And not just any land predator, a pursuit predator that could chase down prey across open ground. It's like evolution looked at regular crocodiles and said, you know what these need. The ability to gallop. The first thing you'd notice about Quinkana, assuming you lived long enough to notice anything, was the legs. These weren't the sprawled limbs of modern crocs. Quinkana's legs were positioned directly beneath its body like a wolf or a big cat. This thing could run, not waddle, not scramble, run. 20 feet of muscle and teeth sprinting across the Australian outback at speeds that would make you wish you'd stayed by the water where the normal crocodiles were. At least those you could see coming. Quinkana hunted in forests, in grasslands, anywhere its prey tried to escape the water. It turned the entire continent into a killing field, but the real horror was in the teeth. Modern crocodiles have conical teeth for gripping. Quinkana had zyphodont teeth, laterally compressed, serrated blades designed for slicing. These weren't meant to hold prey while drowning it. These were meant to cause massive tissue damage, to slice through muscle and tendon, to bleed prey out like a shark on land. The Aboriginal people who first encountered Quinkana must have thought their world had gone insane. Here's an animal that looks like a crocodile, moves like a wolf, and kills like a saber-tooth. The fossil sites tell us these land crocs were everywhere, from tropical Queensland to the arid interior. Nowhere was safe. Recent biomechanical studies show that Quinkana could maintain a galloping gait for extended periods. This wasn't a short-burst predator. It was built for endurance hunting, running prey to exhaustion across the hot Australian landscape. Imagine being chased for miles by something that never tired, never slowed, just kept coming with those serrated teeth, getting closer and closer. For 20 million years, Quinkana ruled the land. It survived ice ages, climate shifts, volcanic eruptions. Nothing could stop a crocodile that had abandoned the water for the land. Nothing except the coming extinction that would erase it so completely that we forgot land crocodiles ever existed, until we started digging up their bones and realizing our nightmares used to be real. By now, you're probably thinking prehistoric Australia couldn't get any worse. You've got venomous dragons, drop-bear predators, and galloping crocodiles. What else could evolution possibly throw at this nightmare continent? The answer is simple. It made everything else bigger, too. Welcome to the age of Australian megafauna, where wombats grew to the size of hippos and kangaroos stood 10 feet tall. This wasn't just scaling up modern animals. This was evolution experimenting with the limits of biological possibility, and the results were absolutely mind-blowing. Let's start with Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived. Imagine a wombat. Now imagine it weighs 3 tons. That's not a typo. 3 tons. The size of a small elephant, but built like a tank with massive claws and a bite force that could snap trees. These weren't gentle giants bumbling through the forest. They were ecosystem engineers that literally reshaped the landscape as they moved. Diprotodon herds, and yes, they traveled in herds, would strip entire forests bare. Their fossilized trackways show groups of 20 or more moving together, creating highways through the bush that other animals followed. When threatened, they formed defensive circles like musk oxen, 3-ton walls of muscle and bone that even Megalania thought twice about attacking. Then there was Crocodiles, the giant short-faced kangaroo. Forget the cute hopping roos you know today. Crocodiles stood 10 feet tall, had arms like a boxer, and a face that looked like it went through a trash compactor. But here's the kicker. It didn't hop. This monster kangaroo walked upright like a person, using those massive arms to pull down tree branches and those clawed hands to fight off predators. In the trees lurked Thylacolio's bigger cousin, and on the ground stalked Megalania's relatives. But the herbivores had evolved their own defenses. Palocestes had claws so massive they made Wolverine jealous. 18-inch curved blades that could disembowel a predator with one swipe. It used them primarily for stripping bark, but anything that got too close learned those claws had other uses. The wetlands had their own giant, Genyornis, the demon duck of doom. This 500-pound flightless bird had a beak that could crack bones and legs that could deliver kicks with the force of a sledgehammer. It wasn't a duck at all, but early explorers took one look at that massive bill and the name stuck. For millions of years, these giants defined Australia. Every ecosystem was built around them. Every predator evolved to hunt them. Every plant adapted to survive them. It was a world where being normal-sized meant you were prey, where evolution favored the massive, the armored, the impossibly powerful. And then, 65,000 years ago, something new arrived. Something small, weak, and without claws or massive teeth. Something that would bring down every giant through nothing but intelligence and determination. Humans had entered the arena, and the age of giants was about to face its greatest challenge. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, just imagine standing in ancient Australia, surrounded by creatures that dwarf anything alive today, knowing that you're about to witness the greatest extinction event in the continent's history. The giants don't know it yet, but their time is almost up. You know that moment in a nature documentary when the wildebeest finally turns and charges the lion? Now imagine that wildebeest weighs 3 tons, has claws like garden spades, and the temperament of a honey badger. That was Diprotodon, Australia's answer to the question, what if we made prey animals so dangerous that predators needed therapy? Here's the thing about Diprotodon that most people don't understand. Yes, it was a herbivore. Yes, it looked like someone inflated a wombat with an industrial air compressor, but this thing was built for war. Those massive claws weren't just for digging. Fossil evidence shows deep gouges in Thylacolio skulls that match Diprotodon claw spacing perfectly. This giant wombat didn't just defend itself, it went on the offensive. Aboriginal stories tell of the bunyip, a massive creature that lived in swamps and waterholes, attacking anyone who came too close. For decades, Europeans dismissed these as myths. Then we started finding Diprotodon fossils in ancient swamp deposits, and the stories suddenly made terrifying sense. These weren't gentle giants. They were territorial nightmares that turned waterholes into killing grounds. The biomechanics are insane. A charging Diprotodon generated the same impact force as a modern car hitting you at 30 miles per hour. But unlike a car, this came with teeth designed to grind tree bark into paste and claws that could dig through solid clay. One fossil from Lake Callabonna shows a Megalania skeleton crushed beneath a Diprotodon, clear evidence that sometimes the prey won. But Diprotodon wasn't alone in the prey that fights back category. Enter Zygomaturus, the swamp thing of prehistoric Australia, smaller than Diprotodon at only 1 ton, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in pure aggression. This semi-aquatic nightmare had a bite force that could snap crocodile spines, and a habit of drowning predators that ventured too close to its territory. The fossil record from Narakorti Caves tells us something remarkable. In layers dating to 100,000 years ago, we find more predator bones showing defensive injuries than prey bones showing kill wounds. Think about that. The prey was winning more often than it was losing. These weren't helpless herbivores waiting to be eaten. They were active combatants in an evolutionary arms race. Palocestes took defense to another level entirely. Nicknamed the Marsupial tapir. This beast had claws so massive they had to walk on their knuckles like a gorilla. But these weren't climbing claws or digging claws. These were weapons. Aboriginal rock art from Arnhem Land shows a creature matching Palocestes' description standing on its hind legs, claws extended fending off multiple smaller predators. Recent CT scans of Diprotodon skulls revealed another defensive secret. A nasal cavity so complex it could produce infrasound, sounds below human hearing that travel for miles and cause instinctive fear in predators. Elephants do this today. Diprotodon did it first. Imagine being a predator stalking through the bush when suddenly you're hit with a wave of pure terror that you can't even hear. You just feel it in your bones. The young were especially vulnerable, but Diprotodon mothers were legendary for their ferocity. One fossilized trackway from South Australia shows an adult Diprotodon's prints suddenly changing direction and accelerating, followed by thylacoleo prints that abruptly stop and turn away. Even the marsupial lion knew better than to mess with a protective mother. For the first humans entering this landscape, these gentle herbivores would have been just as dangerous as the predators. Maybe more so. At least predators were predictable. They wanted to eat you, but a Diprotodon, it might ignore you, charge you, or turn your campsite into a crater just because you pitched your tent too close to its favorite shrub. In prehistoric Australia, even the vegetarians could end you. If you thought Big Bird was scary when you were a kid, wait until you meet his Australian ancestors. Because 50,000 years ago, the continent's birds weren't just big. They were apex predators that made velociraptors look cuddly. And leading this feathered nightmare parade was Genyornis newtoni, better known as the demon duck of doom. Now, before you start laughing at that name, let me paint you a picture. Genyornis stood 7 feet tall, weighed 500 pounds, and had a skull built like a sledgehammer attached to a tree trunk. This wasn't a duck. This was a feathered tank that happened to have a bill that could crack open coconuts like peanuts and delivered kicks that could shatter a Megalania's ribs. The name Demon Duck came from early paleontologists who found that massive bill and made assumptions. What they didn't realize was that bill was a weapon. Recent biomechanical analysis shows Genyornis could generate bite forces comparable to a hyena, but unlike hyenas, it could also run 30 miles per hour on legs built like industrial pistons. Imagine being chased by a bird taller than you, faster than you, with a bite that could crush your skull like an egg. Aboriginal Dreamtime stories speak of the Miharong Paringmol, the giant bird that attacked people who ventured too close to its nesting grounds. For years, scientists thought these were mythological. Then we started finding Genyornis nest sites with human artifacts nearby, and the timeline matched up perfectly. These stories weren't myths. They were survival guides passed down for 50,000 years. But Genyornis wasn't even the scariest bird around. That honour goes to the dromornithids, the real terror birds of Australia. While South America's terror birds get all the press, Australia's versions were bigger, meaner, and lasted longer. Dromornis sturtoni, the Sturton's thunderbird, stood 10 feet tall and weighed 1,100 pounds. That's not a bird. That's a feathered dinosaur that forgot to go extinct. The skull structure tells us everything we need to know about how these birds lived. Massive jaw muscles, reinforced skull bones, and a beak designed not for pecking, but for crushing. These birds didn't just eat plants. They were opportunistic carnivores that could bite through a kangaroo's spine with the same effort you'd use to bite through a carrot. Here's where it gets really terrifying. Unlike the flightless birds we know today, emus, ostriches, cassowaries, these prehistoric giants were smart. Brain cavity analysis shows they had enlarged cerebellums, the part of the brain that handles coordination and planning. These weren't just big birds stumbling around. They were calculating predators that could plan ambushes. The fossil evidence from Thunderbird Lagoon, yes, that's its real name, shows something that still gives paleontologists nightmares. Multiple human skeletons, all showing signs of blunt force trauma, surrounded by Genyornis footprints. The positioning suggests these people were herded into a killing ground. The birds didn't just defend territory, they hunted in groups. Recent discoveries have revealed another horrifying detail. Baby Genyornis weren't cute little ducklings. They were born ready for violence, with fully developed leg muscles and beaks hard enough to crack nuts from day one. Parents didn't need to feed them. They just needed to show them what to kill. By 6 months old, a juvenile Genyornis could take down prey the size of a modern sheep. For the first Australians, these birds represented a unique threat. You could hide from Megalania. You could climb away from Thylacoleo. You could outmaneuver Quinkana. But a creature that could run faster than you, think better than you expected, and worked in coordinated groups. That was a whole different level of nightmare. The extinction of these demon birds 45,000 years ago wasn't just about climate change or hunting. It was about eggs. Humans discovered that a single Genyornis egg could feed a family for days. And unlike hunting a 500-pound bird that could kick your head off, stealing eggs was relatively safe. We literally ate them into extinction, one omelette at a time. But for 2 million years before that, Australia's birds weren't prey. They were predators that dominated entire ecosystems through size, speed, and surprising intelligence. In a land where everything seemed designed to kill you. Sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one that looked the most ridiculous. Never underestimate a demon duck. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Prehistoric Australia wasn't just random monsters wandering around eating each other. It was a perfectly orchestrated symphony of death where every creature, from the tiniest insect to the largest Diprotodon, played a specific role. And once you understand how this ecosystem actually worked, you'll realize it was even more terrifying than the individual predators. Picture the Australian landscape 50,000 years ago. It's nothing like today. The center of the continent, now desert, was covered in vast lakes. Lake Eyre was a permanent inland sea teeming with crocodiles. The forests were triple canopy rainforests in some places, open woodlands in others. And moving through this diverse landscape was a food web so complex, it makes modern ecosystems look like children's drawings. Let's start with the water holes, because in Australia everything revolves around water. During the dry season, these became killing fields that would make the Serengeti look peaceful. Here's how it worked. Diprotodon herds would arrive first, their massive bulk allowing them to push through predator territories. They'd drink, wallow, and turn the water hole into a muddy mess. This disturbance would flush out small prey, attracting mid-sized predators like thylacines and smaller goannas. Then came the kangaroos. Not modern ones, but Procoptodon and its relatives. They had to drink too, but they knew the risks. They'd approach in groups, with designated watchers scanning for danger while others drank. One fossil site in South Australia preserved this exact moment, kangaroo footprints approaching water, then suddenly scattering in all directions. Something had attacked. The ambush predators knew this schedule. Thylacoleo would position itself in trees overlooking game trails to water. Megalania would bury itself in sand near the water's edge, only its nostrils showing. Quinkana would wait in the tall grass, ready to sprint after anything that spooked and ran. It was a gauntlet of death that animals had to run just to drink. But here's the genius of the system. It was sustainable. Predators didn't kill everything. They couldn't. A Megalania that ate a Diprotodon was set for months. A Thylacoleo that took down a large kangaroo might not hunt again for weeks. This wasn't modern efficiency. This was calculated balance maintained over millions of years. The night shift was completely different. As darkness fell, a whole new cast of characters emerged. Thylacoleo became active, using its incredible night vision to hunt. Smaller predators that hid during the day emerged to scavenge kills. And the Tasmanian devil's ancient relatives, imagine a Tasmanian devil the size of a leopard, would drive other predators off carcasses with their bone-crushing jaws. Recent soil analysis from fossil sites has revealed something incredible. The nutrient cycling in these ecosystems was off the charts. A single Diprotodon carcass would feed hundreds of species in sequence. First the killer, then larger scavengers, then smaller ones, then insects, and finally the plants that absorbed the nutrients. Nothing was wasted. Everything was recycled. The migrating herds created what ecologists call nutrient pulses. When thousands of giant marsupials moved through an area, they'd deposit tons of fertilizer, transforming plant growth for months. Plants evolved to time their growing seasons with these migrations. Predators learned the schedules. The entire continent pulsed with these movements like a massive heartbeat. But the real terror was in the edges, the ecotones where different habitats met. Forest edges, lake shores, the transition from woodland to grassland. These were killing grounds where predators from different ecosystems would overlap. A Diprotodon leaving forest for grassland might face Thylacoleo in the trees, Megalania in the grass, and Quinkana if it tried to escape to water. These transition zones were where most fossils are found, because these were where most killing happened. The first humans to enter this system faced a horrifying realization. They weren't apex predators. They were just another prey species that happened to be smart. The ecosystem had no empty niche for them. Every role was filled. Every resource was claimed. Every hunting ground had its owner. They had to carve out their place in a system that had been perfectly balanced for millions of years. And that's exactly what they did, with consequences that would echo for 50,000 years. If prehistoric Australia was an arms race, then evolution was a mad scientist with unlimited funding and zero ethical constraints. Every predator developed weapons so specialized, so horrifically efficient, that modern animals look like they're bringing butter knives to a gunfight. Let's dissect these killing tools and understand why Australian megafauna were the most lethally equipped creatures in Earth's history. Start with Megalania's mouth, a horror show of biological engineering that would make a horror movie designer weep with envy. Those weren't just big teeth. Each tooth was a miniature saw blade with serrations so fine they're barely visible to the naked eye. But here's the kicker. Between those teeth ran grooves connected to venom glands. Not poison. Venom. There's a difference, and it's terrifying. Modern Komodo dragon venom contains over 600 toxins. It prevents blood clotting, drops blood pressure, induces shock, and causes muscle paralysis. Now scale that up to an animal 10 times larger. Megalania's venom wasn't just about killing, it was about tracking. One bite and the prey would bleed continuously, leaving a scent trail a blind tracker could follow. The venom ensured the wound never closed, the bleeding never stopped, and the trail never went cold. But teeth were just the beginning. Let's talk about claws, starting with Thylacolio's thumb spikes. These weren't regular claws that grew from the last finger bone, like in cats. These were attached to a specialized wrist bone that could rotate 180 degrees. Imagine a switchblade that could flip out, lock in place, and had the cutting power of a surgical scalpel. Now imagine it's 5 inches long and backed by muscles that could bench press 500 pounds. The wear patterns on fossilized Thylacolio claws tell us exactly how they were used. Not for climbing, those scratches would be vertical. Not for digging, that would leave blunt wear. These show lateral scratches, drag marks consistent with one motion, disemboweling. One swipe could open a Diprotodon from sternum to pelvis. The curves were perfect for hooking under ribs and pulling out organs. Quinkana took a different approach with its zyphodont teeth. While other crocodilians had conical teeth for gripping, Quinkana's were compressed into blades with serrated edges. Each tooth was like a steak knife, designed to slice rather than puncture. But here's the genius. They were angled backwards. Once Quinkana bit down, pulling away would only drive the teeth deeper. The harder you struggled, the worse the damage. Now for the heavyweight champion of bite force. Thylacolio's jaws, pound for pound. Nothing that ever lived could match it. The key was the muscle attachment points. Most predators have jaw muscles that attach part way up the skull. Thylacolio's attached at the very top, creating maximum leverage. Combined with teeth that worked like bolt cutters, it could bite through a kangaroo's femur like you'd bite through a pretzel stick. But the scariest weapons might have been the ones you couldn't see. Diprotodon's infrasound capability wasn't just defense, it was psychological warfare. Infrasound causes involuntary fear responses. Your conscious mind doesn't even register it, but your body starts pumping adrenaline, your heart rate spikes, and you feel an overwhelming urge to run. Now imagine trying to hunt something that could broadcast pure terror directly into your nervous system. Even seemingly harmless creatures packed hidden weapons. Genyornis's bill contained a hook at the tip that paleontologists puzzled over for years. CT scans finally revealed the answer. It was connected to specialized muscles that could snap shut with the speed of a bear trap. Not for cracking seeds, for cracking skulls. One peck to the head of a small predator and it was lights out. The chemical weapons were just as terrifying. Recent analysis of Megalania teeth found microscopic tubes that would have housed bacteria. Not accidental infection, but weaponized microbes, like modern Komodo dragons that cultivate specific bacteria in their mouths. Megalania turned its bite into biological warfare. Even if you survived the venom, the infection would get you. For the first humans facing these weapons, stone tools must have seemed pathetically inadequate. A sharp rock against venomous bites, switchblade claws and jaws that could crush bone? It wasn't a fair fight. It was barely a fight at all. The fact that humans survived, thrived, and eventually outlasted these biological weapon systems is testament to the most powerful weapon of all: intelligence. But make no mistake, for tens of thousands of years, humans were the underdogs in this arms race. Every fossil, every scratch mark, every healed bone tells the same story. In prehistoric Australia, everything was designed to kill, and it was exceptionally good at its job. Every fossil tells a story, but in prehistoric Australia, they're all horror stories. Modern forensic science applied to ancient bones has revealed exactly how these creatures killed, how their victims died, and most disturbingly, how common violent death really was. Welcome to Paleontological CSI Australia, where every case is cold and every victim has been dead for at least 40,000 years. Let's start with the smoking guns, bite marks preserved in fossilized bone. At Lake Callabonna, paleontologists found a Diprotodon skeleton with puncture wounds that perfectly match Thylacolio's canine spacing. But here's what made researchers' blood run cold. The bone shows signs of healing. This 3-ton wombat survived a marsupial lion attack, lived for weeks afterward, and then died from infection. The fossil preserved not just death, but suffering. Megalania victims tell even grimmer tales. One kangaroo skeleton from Queensland shows a bite mark on the femur with strange erosion patterns around it. Analysis revealed the truth. Venom had prevented the wound from healing while simultaneously breaking down the bone tissue. This animal lived for days, maybe weeks, as venom and infection slowly dissolved its leg from the inside out. It's the kind of death that makes you grateful for modern medicine. But the most disturbing discoveries come from mass death sites. Alcuta in the Northern Territory preserved a killing field where hundreds of animals died together, not from disease or drought, but from predation. The positioning of skeletons tells the story. Herbivores driven into a natural trap, predators following, and then everyone dying in a massive pile-up of violence. It's like finding a 100,000-year-old highway accident, except everyone was trying to eat each other. Forensic analysis techniques have revealed details that make your skin crawl. Micro-CT scanning of tooth marks can determine not just what bit what, but how hard, from what angle, and in what sequence. One juvenile Genyornis skeleton shows 17 different bite marks from at least 3 different predator species. This wasn't a kill. It was a feeding frenzy, preserved in bone. The stress markers in bones tell their own stories. Growth lines in tusks and teeth, like tree rings but for animals, show periods of starvation, injury, and recovery. Diprotodon tusks reveal that most adults survive multiple predator attacks throughout their lives. Healed fractures, claw marks on skulls, teeth broken and regrown. These weren't peaceful giants occasionally facing danger. They were constantly under assault. Here's something that'll haunt you: coprolites, fossilized feces. Megalania coprolites have been found containing partially digested bone fragments from juvenile Diprotodons, complete with tooth marks showing they were swallowed in chunks. But some fragments show signs of weathering, meaning Megalania would wound prey, follow it for days as it weakened, and then consume it piece by piece as it died. Not a clean kill. A methodical harvest. Cave deposits reveal the most complete death records. In Narracoorta caves, natural pitfall traps preserved everything that fell in over millennia. The layering tells us kill rates, predator-prey ratios, even seasonal hunting patterns. During drought years, predator remains increased dramatically. When prey got scarce, Predators turned on each other. Thylacoleo bones bearing thylacoleo bite marks. Cannibalism as survival strategy. But the human chapters are the most revealing. At Lake Mungo, human remains from 42,000 years ago show something remarkable: defensive wounds, cuts on arm bones consistent with fending off attack, a skull fracture that matches Genyornis build dimensions. These people didn't just coexist with Megafauna, they were in active combat with it. Isotope analysis of bones reveals diets, and the results are terrifying. Megalania bones show they ate everything, from tiny wallabies to giant Diprotodon. But seasonal variations in isotopes reveal they preferred human-sized prey. We weren't special to them, we were just the right portion size. The extinction timeline, written in layers of bone, shows it wasn't quick or clean. Different species vanished at different rates in different places, but the pattern is clear. Wherever humans established permanent presence, Megafauna began dying faster than they could reproduce. Not from overhunting alone, but from disruption of the delicate balance between predator and prey. The last Megafauna fossils are the saddest. Smaller than their ancestors, showing signs of malnutrition found in marginal habitats where their kind never lived before. These weren't animals dying in their prime. They were the last survivors of dying species, pushed to the edges of a world that no longer had room for giants. Every fossil from prehistoric Australia is a testimony to violence, but also to survival, adaptation, and the incredible resilience of life in the face of constant terror. For 50,000 years, these bones waited in the ground, holding their secrets. Now they're telling us exactly what it was like when monsters ruled Australia. And trust me, you wouldn't have wanted to be there. Picture this. You're part of a small band of humans, maybe 30 people total. You've just crossed from New Guinea on bamboo rafts, following the coastline south. The journey took months, maybe years. You're expecting to find familiar landscapes, similar animals, manageable predators. Instead, you've just walked into Hell's Own Zoo. The first night would have been the worst. That's when you'd have heard them. Sounds that didn't exist anywhere else on Earth. The infrasonic rumble of Diprotodon herds communicating in frequencies that made your chest vibrate. The territorial roar of Thylacoleo, not quite a lion's roar, not quite anything you could identify. And worse, the silence where there should have been small animal sounds, because everything small had already been eaten. These first Australians weren't primitive. They were the descendants of people who'd already survived migrations across Asia, navigated treacherous waters, and established themselves on countless islands. They had language, complex tools, and sophisticated hunting strategies. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for what waited in Australia. The archaeological evidence from Majidbebi rock shelter in northern Australia tells us exactly when this nightmare began. Stone tools dated to 65,000 years ago, found in the same layers as Megafauna remains. But here's what's chilling. The cut marks on those bones show hesitation, experimental butchering. These people were trying to figure out how to process animals unlike anything they'd ever seen. Imagine their first encounter with Megalania. You're foraging for plants you recognize, staying close to the group. Then you notice birds going silent. That's never good. You freeze, scan the bush, see nothing. But Megalania has already seen you. It's been tracking your scent for hours, following the strange new smell that appeared on its territory. When it strikes, it's from a direction you never expected. These monsters could climb. The oral histories of Aboriginal Australians preserve these first encounters in ways that make archaeologists' hearts race. Stories of the wowie, a giant lizard that hid in caves and swallowed people whole. The bunyip, a massive creature in waterholes that grabbed the unwary. For decades, Europeans dismissed these as myths. Now we know they were field guides. Survival manuals passed down for 2,000 generations. What saved these first Australians wasn't strength or weapons. It was observation and communication. They had to learn entirely new rules. In Asia, you avoided water because of crocodiles. In Australia, you avoided land because of Quinkana. In Asia, you slept in trees to avoid ground predators. In Australia, trees held thelicolio. Every survival strategy had to be rebuilt from scratch. The learning curve was written in bones. Human remains from this period show trauma patterns unlike anywhere else. Defensive wounds on arms from fending off attacks, skull fractures from powerful blows, but also healed injuries, showing that people survived attacks and shared their knowledge. Each survivor became a teacher, each death a lesson for the living. Fire became their first real defense. Not just campfires, but systematic burning. The first Australians discovered that many megafauna, despite their size, feared fire intensely. Diprotodon would detour miles around burned areas. Thylacoleo wouldn't hunt where smoke lingered. By controlling fire, humans created safe zones, temporary bubbles of security in a landscape of death. But the real genius was in their social structure. These small bands maintained connections across vast distances, sharing information about threats and resources. When one group discovered that Genyornis eggs were edible, and that stealing eggs was safer than fighting adult birds, that knowledge spread. When someone figured out that Megalania avoided certain plants, everyone learned to camp near those plants. For the megafauna, humans were a new kind of problem. Not particularly dangerous individually, but unpredictable. They used projectile weapons. They hunted in coordinated groups. They used fire as a tool. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to get smarter over time. What worked against humans one year might fail the next. The fossil record shows this wasn't an instant conquest. For 20,000 years, humans and megafauna coexisted in an uneasy balance. Humans learned to avoid the killing grounds, to respect territories, to take only what they needed. They became part of the ecosystem, just another predator in a land full of them. But they were predators who could plan, remember, and most importantly, teach their children. Every Aboriginal Australian alive today is descended from these incredible survivors. People who faced dragons and won, who turned a continent of nightmares into home, who looked at 23-foot venomous lizards and thought, "We can handle this." That's not just survival. That's the kind of stubborn determination that makes humans the scariest species of all. Here's something that should be impossible. Humans, armed with pointed sticks and rocks, successfully hunting creatures that weighed more than cars. But the fossil record doesn't lie. Cut marks on Diprotodon bones, spear points embedded in Genyornis vertebrae, burn patterns on Megalania scuties. Our ancestors didn't just survive among giants, they hunted them. And the way they did it was absolutely brilliant. First, forget everything Hollywood taught you about prehistoric hunting. No screaming charges with spears raised, no dramatic solo battles. The first Australians who tried that approach fed the local thelicolio population. The ones who survived learned that hunting megafauna required planning, patience, and psychological warfare on a scale that would impress modern military strategists. Let's start with the weapons, because that's where the genius begins. Archaeologists have found wooden spears at Australian sites that are engineering marvels. Not just pointed sticks, but carefully crafted tools with hafted stone points, balanced for throwing and designed to break off inside wounds. Why break? Because a Diprotodon with a broken spear tip in its side would die from infection within weeks. Humans didn't need to kill it. They just needed to wound it and wait. The Woomera, the spear thrower that Indigenous Australians still use today, was a game changer. This simple lever multiplied throwing force by 300%, turning a human arm into a launching system that could drive a spear through thick hide at 40 meters. But here's the brilliant part. It was silent. No bowstring twang, no warning, just sudden, devastating impact from beyond the range any animal expected threats to come from. But the real innovation wasn't in weapons, it was in tactics. Take the fire drive, a hunting method so effective it literally changed the continent. Humans would wait for the right wind conditions, then set strategic fires to create walls of flame that funneled panicking animals toward cliffs, bogs, or ambush points. Imagine being a 3-ton Diprotodon running from flames, only to realize you've been herded into a dead-end canyon where humans wait with spears. Waterhole ambushes were even more diabolical. Humans learned that Megafauna needed huge amounts of water and would risk everything to drink. So they'd poison water sources upstream with crushed toxic plants, then wait at the clean water downstream. Desperate animals would arrive already weakened, walking into carefully prepared killing grounds. It was chemical warfare, Stone Age style. The fossil evidence from Cuddy Springs shows something remarkable. Selective hunting. Humans weren't killing every animal they could. They targeted specific individuals, young adults just past prime breeding age, solitary males, injured animals. They were managing the herds, taking only what wouldn't damage breeding populations. This wasn't desperation hunting. It was wildlife management. Here's where it gets really clever. Humans discovered that different megafauna had different weak points. Diprotodon's thick hide was nearly impenetrable, but its belly was soft. So they dug pit traps on game trails, just deep enough to catch a leg, forcing the giant to rear up and expose its underside. Quinkana had powerful legs but poor peripheral vision. Hunters would work in teams, one group distracting from the front while others attacked the blind spots. The psychological warfare was perhaps most impressive. Humans learned to mimic megafauna distress calls, luring predators and prey into ambushes. They used smoke to mask their scent, mud to camouflage their appearance, and patience that would drive modern humans insane. Some hunts took weeks, tracking wounded animals, keeping them moving, preventing them from feeding or resting until exhaustion made the kill safe. But the masterstroke was turning predators into tools. Humans learned that wounded prey attracted Megalania and Thylacoleo, so they'd wound an animal, follow it at a safe distance, and wait for larger predators to make the kill. Then they'd use fire and noise to drive the predators off and claim the carcass. Why fight a Diprotodon yourself when you could let a Thylacoleo do it for you? The communal nature of these hunts was crucial. Taking down a Diprotodon required 20 to 30 people working in perfect coordination. Some to drive, some to ambush, some to track, some to process the kill. Children served as lookouts. Elders directed operations from safe vantage points. Everyone had a role, and failure meant starvation. Recent isotope analysis of human bones from this period shows something fascinating: seasonal hunting patterns. Humans learned migration routes, breeding seasons, and drought patterns. They knew when animals would be vulnerable and planned accordingly. This wasn't opportunistic hunting. It was scheduled, systematic harvesting based on deep ecological knowledge. The success rate was still terrifyingly low. Fossil sites show failed hunts far outnumber successful ones. But when a hunt succeeded, it fed the entire band for weeks. One Diprotodon provided 3,000 pounds of meat, plus hide for shelters, bones for tools, and sinew for binding. It was worth the risk, worth the planning, worth the patience. What's most remarkable is that humans managed this while being hunted themselves. Every hunt risked attracting Megalania. Every kill site became a potential battlefield as predators arrived to contest the carcass. The hunters were simultaneously predator and prey, walking a knife's edge between starvation and becoming something else's meal. These weren't the dominant apex predators we became later. These were clever apes using brains to punch far above their weight class. David didn't beat Goliath through strength. He did it through intelligence, cooperation, and the kind of stubborn persistence that would eventually make humans the most dangerous species on Earth. But first, they had to survive 20,000 years of coexistence with monsters. 20,000 years. That's how long humans shared Australia with Megafauna. To put that in perspective, all of recorded human history is only 5,000 years. The Egyptians built the pyramids 4,500 years ago. 20,000 years is 4 times longer than our entire civilization has existed. And every single day of those 20 millennia, humans woke up in a world where they could be eaten. This wasn't some brief encounter that ended quickly. This was 800 generations of humans living alongside dragons, developing cultures, raising children, and creating societies while dodging creatures that belonged in nightmares. The psychological impact alone would have been staggering. Imagine knowing that every time you left camp, every water run, every hunting trip, might be your last. The archaeological record from sites like Devil's Lair in Western Australia shows us what daily life was like. Layers of occupation spanning millennia, with stone tools mixed with megafauna bones throughout, not at the bottom with bones on top, showing sequential occupation. Mixed together, humans were making tools from thylacoleo bones while thylacoleo were still hunting humans. That's hardcore coexistence. What's fascinating is how human culture adapted. Rock art from this period doesn't just show the animals, it shows specific behaviors. A painting from Kimberley shows what appears to be a thylacoleo in a tree, waiting to drop. Another from Arnhem Land depicts humans in a defensive circle, spears pointing outward, while something large approaches. These weren't decorative art. They were survival guides painted on stone. The landscape itself became a teaching tool. Every landmark had a story, usually involving death. That water hole? 3 people were taken by Quinkana there. This rocky outcrop? Perfect thylacoleo ambush site. That grove of trees? Megalania nesting area. Go around, far around. Children learned geography through terror, memorizing danger zones before they could properly walk. Sleeping arrangements reveal the constant fear. Archaeological sites show humans didn't sleep in the open like African hunter-gatherers. They built elaborate barriers, chose sites with limited access points, and maintained fires that burned all night. One site in South Australia shows evidence of thorn barriers 6 feet high surrounding the sleeping area. That's not for privacy. That's for survival. The development of language itself was probably influenced by these pressures. Aboriginal Australian languages have incredibly specific terms for animal behaviours, landscape features, and survival strategies. Not just big lizard, but different words for big lizard basking, big lizard hunting, big lizard with eggs to protect. When precise communication means life or death, language evolves precision. Tool development accelerated beyond anything seen elsewhere. While humans in safer environments could use the same tools for millennia, Australians constantly innovated. Multi-barbed spears that would lodge in wounds. Throwing sticks that could break a Genyornis leg from 30 meters. Specialized cutting tools just for processing thick megafauna hide. Necessity drove innovation at breakneck speed. Social structures adapted too. Band sizes in Australia during this period were larger than elsewhere, 50 to 60 people instead of the typical 25 to 30. Why? Safety in numbers. More eyes to watch for predators. More spears to fend off attacks. More people to ensure someone survived to raise the children if hunters didn't return. These weren't just social groups. They were mutual defense packs. The psychological strategies were remarkable. Humans developed what psychologists now call hypervigilance. Constant environmental scanning that would be diagnosed as anxiety disorder today, but was essential survival then. Aboriginal Australians still show faster threat detection in peripheral vision than other populations. 20,000 years of selection pressure leaves its marks. Children's play reflected this reality. Archaeologists find toy weapons at every site, not occasional toys, but standardized training tools. 6-year-olds practiced spear throwing. 8-year-olds learned tracking. By puberty, children had spent more hours in survival training than modern kids spend in school. Play was preparation for not dying. But here's what's amazing. Humans didn't just survive. They thrived. Population estimates show steady growth throughout this period. Birth rates exceeded death rates. Bands expanded into new territories. They developed art, music, complex spiritual beliefs. They fell in love, raised families, told jokes around campfires, all while sharing the continent with creatures that could end them in seconds. The spiritual beliefs that developed during this time are telling. The rainbow serpent, one of the oldest continuing religious traditions on Earth, might preserve memories of Megalania. Dreamtime stories encode survival information in narrative form, which animals to avoid, where to find water, how to read seasonal changes. Religion became a vessel for transmitting survival knowledge across generations. Trade networks from this period show humans weren't isolated in terror. Ochre from specific sources traveled thousands of kilometers. Shell ornaments from the coast appear in interior sites. People were moving, trading, intermarrying between bands. They built continental-scale social networks while dodging continental-scale predators. The end of this coexistence period wasn't sudden. The fossil record shows a gradual decline in megafauna numbers over the last 5,000 years of overlap. Some species vanished from certain regions but persisted in others. Humans and megafauna were locked in an evolutionary dance, each adapting to the other's adaptations. But humans had one advantage. We could adapt culturally in a single generation. Megafauna needed thousands of years to evolve new strategies. By 45,000 years ago, most megafauna were gone. The survivors had lived through 20,000 years of coexistence with the most dangerous animals Earth ever produced. They'd raised 800 generations of children in a world where death waited behind every tree, and they'd won. Not through strength or speed, but through the most human qualities of all: intelligence, cooperation, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to give up. Those 20,000 years forged the human spirit in ways we're still discovering. Every Australian Aboriginal person today carries the genetic and cultural legacy of people who looked at a continent full of monsters and said, "Yeah, we can make this work." That's not just survival. That's the kind of stubborn optimism that makes humans unstoppable. Here's something that should give you chills. Aboriginal Australians have been telling consistent stories about giant animals for 50,000 years. The same stories with the same details passed down through 2,000 generations. And when paleontologists finally started finding megafauna fossils, they matched the stories exactly. These aren't myths. They're the oldest field guides on Earth. Take the story of the Kadimakara, told by the Diri people of South Australia. Massive creatures that lived in the lakes, got trapped when the water dried up, and died in groups. Pure mythology, right? Until paleontologists excavated Lake Callabonna and found exactly that. Hundreds of Diprotodon fossils in dried lake beds, perfectly matching the oral tradition. The stories were accurate eyewitness accounts, preserved for 45,000 years. The Adnyamathanha people of the Flinders Ranges tell of the Yamuti, giant creatures that would rear up on their hind legs and had feet that pointed backward. Nonsense. until you realized Diprotodon did rear up defensively and had inward-pointing feet that would look backward in soft mud. Details no one could guess from fossils. Details that only make sense if someone saw living Diprotodon and passed that knowledge down for 1,800 generations. But the most terrifying stories are about the predators. The wowie, a giant goanna that lived in caves and swallowed people whole. The gouage, a massive creature that would climb trees and drop on victims. The mindi, a snake so large it carved valleys as it moved. For years, scientists dismissed these as exaggerations. Then we found Megalania, Thylacoleo and Wanambi fossils, and suddenly the stories weren't exaggerations at all. What's remarkable is the accuracy. Aboriginal stories describe Thylacoleo as having a distinctive call, not a roar like modern big cats, but a sound like wind through a hollow tree. Fossilized throat structures suggest Thylacoleo's larynx would have produced exactly that sound. How do you fake that detail? You don't. You remember it for 40,000 years. The bunyip stories are perhaps most fascinating, described as a massive creature living in billabongs and swamps, with a booming call that could be heard for miles. Features varied by region. Some describe tusks, others a horse-like tail. Some mention dark fur. Cryptozoologists went crazy trying to find living bunyips. But here's the thing. Different Diprotodon species lived in different regions, with slightly different features. The stories weren't confused. They were regionally accurate descriptions of different types of Diprotodon. The rainbow serpent, one of the most important Aboriginal spiritual figures, might preserve memories of Megalania or giant pythons. Described as a massive creature that created waterways as it moved, lived in deep pools, and could swallow humans whole. The reverence mixed with terror in these stories speaks to creatures that were very real and very dangerous. Some stories encode specific survival information. The Ngayunangalku, or cannibal beings described by Western desert peoples, match Thylacoleo behavior patterns, ambush predators that cached victims in trees and returned to feed over days. The stories warn to avoid trees with claw marks and never camp under large branches. That's not mythology. That's a safety manual. The temporal depth of these stories is staggering. The Gunditjmara people of Victoria tell of a time when the land was different, when plains existed where now there's ocean, when you could walk to distant islands. Sea level analysis confirms that 10,000 years ago, when those areas were last dry land, someone saw that landscape and preserved it in oral tradition. These people maintained accurate geographic information for 400 generations. But here's what's really incredible. The emotional content. These stories don't just describe what the creatures looked like. They convey what it felt like to encounter them. The paralyzing fear when Howie's shadow fell across you. The helplessness of watching someone dragged into a billabong by bunyip. The specific terror of hearing Thylacoleo's hollow wind call in the darkness. You can't fake emotional authenticity across 50,000 years. The stories also preserve extinct animal behaviors. Multiple Aboriginal groups describe the Mihirung Paringmal, Genyonis, as gathering in large groups during breeding season and making tremendous noise. Fossil sites confirm Genyonis nested communally. Stories describe specific plants these birds ate, matching seeds found in fossilized gizzard stones. This isn't cultural memory, it's scientific data encoded in narrative. Some linguists have analyzed the stability of these oral traditions and found something astounding. Key stories show less linguistic drift than written texts experience over just centuries. The mechanisms for preserving accuracy, ritual telling, correction by elders, serious consequences for changing stories, created oral traditions more stable than books. What we're looking at isn't mythology that happens to match reality. we're looking at the oldest continuous culture on Earth, preserving accurate naturalist observations for 50,000 years. Every Aboriginal elder who tells these stories is a living library containing information older than agriculture, older than cities, older than written language itself. Modern Aboriginal people still know where to find megafauna fossils because the stories tell them where the creatures died. They can still identify which water sources were bunyip homes, which cliffs Thelacolio used for ambush, which trees Howie climbed. The stories aren't just about the past. They're GPS coordinates to prehistory. Think about what this means. Somewhere, 50,000 years ago, a human being watched a Thalacoleo hunt, survived to tell about it, and told that story so well it lasted until today. That story was deemed so important it survived ice ages, sea level changes, and the colonization of Australia. It survived because it was true, because it was important, and because somewhere deep in human consciousness, we never forget the things that tried to kill us. These aren't fairy tales. They're field notes from humanity's most dangerous assignment, surviving among monsters. And the fact they still exist, still accurate after 2,000 generations, might be the most incredible human achievement you've never heard of. Let's be brutally honest here. In a straight fight against any Australian megafauna, humans would lose. Every single time. We were slower than everything, weaker than everything, had worse senses than everything. Our teeth were jokes, our claws non-existent, our hide so thin a sharp grass could cut it. By all rights, we should have been extinct within a generation of reaching Australia. Instead, we conquered it. How? By cheating on a scale that would make evolution itself rage quit. The first cheat was tools, but not the tools you're thinking of. Yes, humans had spears and stone knives, but the real game changers were the ones that multiplied human capability. The Woomera, that simple spear thrower, turned weak human arms into artillery. A trained hunter could put a spear through a Diprotodon's hide at 100 meters. That's not hunting, that's assassination from beyond visual range. But even better were the tools that didn't kill directly. Nets woven from human hair and plant fibers could trap prey without risking combat. Blinds built near waterholes let humans attack from concealment. Noisemakers, hollow logs that amplified sound, could drive entire herds off cliffs without humans getting close. We turned the entire landscape into a weapon. Fire was the ultimate force multiplier. Not just campfires for protection, but fire as a hunting tool, a landscape management system, and psychological warfare all rolled into one. Aboriginal Australians developed fire stick farming, controlled burns that created a mosaic of habitats. Fresh growth attracted herbivores to predictable locations. Burned areas created clear sightlines for hunting. Fire breaks protected camps from wildfire and megafauna. The genius was in the timing. Burn too early and rain douses your fire. Too late and everything's too dry, creating catastrophic blazes. Aboriginal Australians learned to read weather patterns, plant growth cycles, and animal behavior to time burns perfectly. They weren't just using fire. They were conducting ecosystem-wide chemistry experiments with flame as their only reagent. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Humans use fire to hunt without even being present. They'd set delayed action fires using slow-burning materials, creating fire fronts that would drive animals into prepared killing zones hours or days later. Imagine being a Diprotodon running from flames, exhausted and terrified, stumbling into a bog where humans waited with spears. You never even saw your killers until it was too late. The toolmaking itself reveals incredible sophistication. Australian stone tools from this period show standardization. The same designs across thousands of miles. That means systematic teaching, quality control, and continent-wide information exchange. These weren't random rocks bashed together. They were engineered devices with specific purposes, optimal angles, and designed failure points. Composite tools were the real innovation. A spear isn't just a pointy stick, it's a shaft selected for flexibility, a point napped for penetration, bindings made from processed sinew, and adhesives derived from specific tree resins. Each component required different expertise. Making one hunting spear involved materials, science, engineering, chemistry, and physics. All without writing, measuring tools, or YouTube tutorials. But tools were only half the equation. The real weapon was intelligence, specifically the ability to think in timescales beyond immediate needs. Humans cached tools at hunting grounds for future use. They maintained trading relationships to access quality stone from hundreds of miles away. They passed technical knowledge across generations without loss of fidelity. No other predator invested in the future like this. The cleverest adaptation was social. Humans developed what anthropologists call pooled energy budgets. Fancy talk for systematic sharing. One successful hunt fed everyone, successful or not. This meant specialists could develop. The band's best napper could focus on tool making. The best tracker could concentrate on finding prey. The best firekeeper maintained flames 24/7. Specialization meant expertise. Expertise meant innovation. Innovation meant survival. Language itself was a tool. Not just communication, but complex conditional planning. If the wind shifts north, we light the southern fires and drive them toward the cliff. But if it stays south, we wait until tomorrow. Try explaining that plan without grammar. Human language let us coordinate actions across time and space in ways no animal could match. The psychological tools were subtlest, but perhaps most important. Humans developed delayed gratification, the ability to pass up easy prey for better opportunities, risk assessment, knowing when to hunt and when to hide, pattern recognition that extended beyond individual experience to collective memory. We didn't just learn from our mistakes, we learned from our great-great-grandmother's mistakes. Here's the ultimate clever adaptation. We turned other predators into tools. Humans learned to interpret thylacoleo calls to locate prey. We followed Megalania at safe distances to scavenge their kills. We used Quinkana presence to drive prey into areas where the land crocs couldn't follow, but we could. Every danger became a potential resource if you were smart enough. The cumulative effect was devastating to Megafauna, not because humans were super predators, but because we were unpredictable. Animals that had evolved specific defenses against specific threats suddenly faced opponents who changed tactics constantly. What worked against humans last season might fail catastrophically this season. We were an evolutionary moving target. Modern humans look at stone tools in museums and see primitive technology. But those simple-looking implements represent cognitive capabilities that took millions of years to develop. The ability to see a rock and envision a tool, to plan complex hunts requiring perfect timing, to maintain fire continuously for generations, to encode survival information in stories that lasted millennia. We didn't survive prehistoric Australia because we were strong. We survived because we were smart, social, and absolutely relentless in our refusal to be eaten. Every human alive today descends from people who looked at a continent full of monsters and thought, we can work with this. Not through physical prowess, but through the most dangerous adaptation ever evolved. The ability to imagine a different future and then create it. That's why the Megafauna lost. Not because we were better predators, but because we were something scarier. Predators who could change faster than evolution could counter. In the arms race between human cleverness and Megafauna adaptation, brains beat brawn every time. It just took 20,000 years to prove the point. 46,000 years ago, Australia started dying. Not dramatically, not obviously, but dying nonetheless. The continent that had supported giants for millions of years began a transformation so gradual that no single generation would have noticed. But looking back, we can see it clearly. The beginning of the end for the megafauna. The climate data tells a horror story in slow motion. Average temperatures rose by 4 degrees Celsius over 10,000 years. Doesn't sound like much? That's the difference between New York and Miami. For cold-blooded Megalania, whose activity levels depended on ambient temperature, those few degrees meant the difference between effective hunting and starvation. But temperature was just the opening act. The real killer was moisture, or rather, the lack of it. The monsoons that brought life-giving rain to northern Australia began failing. Not every year, but enough to matter. Lake Eyre, once a permanent inland sea teeming with life, began its transformation into the salt flat we know today. Each dry year left it smaller. Each wet year failed to refill it completely. The fossil pollen records are like reading a plant obituary. Rainforest species vanished from areas where they'd thrived for millions of years. Eucalyptus, that hardy, fire-adapted genus, began its conquest of the continent. Where diverse forests once stood, monocultures of gum trees took over. For specialized feeders like Palochestes adapted to specific plants. This was catastrophic. Water sources didn't just shrink, they became unpredictable. A billabong that had been permanent for 1,000 generations might dry up in a single bad year. Diprotodon herds, programmed by millions of years of evolution to follow specific routes to specific water sources, would arrive to find cracked mud where there should have been water. The young and old died first. Then the breeding adults. Fire regimes changed too. Drier vegetation meant more frequent, more intense wildfires. Not the controlled burns humans used, but catastrophic firestorms that destroyed vast areas. Thylacoleo, dependent on tree cover for ambush hunting, found its habitat fragmented into isolated patches. Territories that once supported breeding pairs could barely sustain single individuals. The cascading effects were brutal. Large herbivores need massive amounts of vegetation daily. As plant diversity decreased, nutrition suffered. Malnourished Diprotodon produced fewer offspring. Smaller births meant easier prey for predators. More predation meant fewer adults reaching breeding age. The mathematical spiral toward extinction had begun. For Genyornis, the specialist feeder, it was even worse. These giant birds required specific plants for successful breeding, plants that provided the exact nutrients needed for their massive eggs. As those plants became rare, Genyornis clutches failed. Eggs didn't hatch. Those that did produced weak chicks that didn't survive. Evolution had made them too specialized for a generalizing world. The archaeological record shows humans adapting rapidly to these changes. Toolkits from this period become more diverse, suggesting exploitation of new food sources. But megafauna, locked into bodies and behaviors shaped by millions of years of evolution, couldn't change fast enough. What took humans a generation to adapt to required megafauna thousands of years. The tragedy was that this had happened before. Australia's megafauna had survived ice ages, warm periods, and climate swings for millions of years. But this time was different. This time, they faced climate change while also dealing with a new predator that used fire, hunted strategically, and competed for the best remaining habitat. Neither challenge alone would have been fatal. Together, they were devastating. By 45,000 years ago, the perfect storm was fully formed. Climate turning hostile, habitat fragmenting, a new predator applying constant pressure. The giants that had ruled Australia since the age of dinosaurs were about to discover that size, strength, and millions of years of success meant nothing when the rules of the game changed too fast to follow. If the megafauna extinction was a murder, then water was the weapon. Not floods or tsunamis, but the slow, inexorable disappearance of water from a continent that had been lush for millions of years. What happened to Australia between 45,000 and 30,000 years ago was less like disaster and more like watching someone die of thirst in slow motion. Lake Carpentaria, once a freshwater lake the size of England, began its death spiral. Fed by rivers that had flowed for millions of years, it started missing its annual refills. Monsoons that should have brought flooding brought drizzle. Rivers that should have raged became trickles. The lake shrank, concentrated, and turned saline. The freshwater megafauna that depended on it, giant turtles, massive crocodiles, oversized fish, died in water that burned their gills. The Murray-Darling Basin tells the same story in fossilized mud. Core samples show dramatic drops in water flow starting 45,000 years ago. Not drought. That implies temporary. This was permanent aridification. Rivers that Diprotodon herds had followed for millennia simply stopped flowing. Billabongs that had been permanent became seasonal. Seasonal ones became memories. For the megafauna, this wasn't just about thirst. Water sources were the organizing principles of their lives. Mating happened at traditional waterholes. Territories centered on reliable streams. Migration routes connected water source to water source like dots on a map. When those dots started disappearing, the entire map became useless. Diprotodon responded the only way it could, by walking farther. Fossil trackways from this period show something heartbreaking. Longer and longer journeys between water sources. Groups that once traveled 10 kilometers between drinks were walking 50, then 100. Calves couldn't make these distances. Pregnant females couldn't sustain the energy demand. The herds began to fragment. Predators initially benefited. As prey concentrated around remaining water sources, hunting became easier. Megalania could simply wait by the last waterhole in a region and let desperate prey come to it. But this bounty was temporary. As prey populations crashed, predators faced their own crisis. A thelacolio that once ambushed prey every few days now went weeks without successful hunts. The vegetation changes were equally dramatic. Plants that required regular water disappeared, replaced by drought-adapted species. But adaptation takes time, and the intermediate period was barren. Whole regions that once supported diverse plant communities became monocultures of the hardiest species. For specialized feeders, it was like replacing a buffet with a single dish they couldn't digest. Human archaeological sites from this period cluster around permanent water, but permanent had a new definition. Water sources humans had used for generations dried up, forcing relocations. The difference was that humans could plan these moves, scout new territories, and adapt their technology. Megafauna could only follow instinct, and instinct was calibrated for a world that no longer existed. The feedback loops were vicious. Less water meant less vegetation. Less vegetation meant more erosion. More erosion meant water sources filled with sediment. Filled water sources meant even less available water. Each problem amplified the others in a spiral that accelerated over time. By 35,000 years ago, interior Australia was becoming the arid center we know today. The megalithic monsoon that had watered the continent's heart for millions of years had shifted north, leaving behind a desert that expanded year by year. Species that had evolved in lush environments found themselves in landscapes that might as well have been alien planets. The last lakes told the saddest stories. Fossil sites preserve mass death events where entire populations died together. Not from predation or disease, but from lakes drying faster than animals could escape. Imagine being a Diprotodon, programmed by evolution to stay near water, watching that water disappear day by day until it's too late to leave. This wasn't climate change as we think of it today, sudden and human-caused. This was natural variation on a scale that dwarfed anything in human experience. But for the megafauna, the cause didn't matter. Only the effect, a continent slowly strangling on its own dryness, taking its giants with it. The end wasn't uniform or simultaneous. Across Australia, different species made their last stands in different places at different times. But by 40,000 years ago, the writing wasn't just on the wall, it was carved into the landscape itself. The age of giants was ending, not with a bang, but with 1,000 whimpers. In Tasmania, separated from the mainland by rising seas, some megafauna lasted longer. The island became a refuge where giant kangaroos and massive wombats persisted while their mainland relatives vanished. But isolation brought its own problems. Populations too small to maintain genetic diversity. Islands too small to support sustainable numbers. The Tasmanian megafauna didn't die. They faded away. On the mainland, the last Diprotodon herds congregated around permanent water sources that were anything but permanent. Lake Callabonna became a death trap where hundreds of giants mired themselves in mud, desperate for water that no longer existed. The fossil site preserves them in their final moments, adults forming protective circles around young, all dying together in a gesture of futile defiance. Thelacolio made its last stand in the eastern forests, where tree cover still provided hunting grounds. But these weren't the extensive forests of old. They were fragments, islands of green in an increasingly brown landscape. Territories that once supported breeding pairs now couldn't sustain single individuals. The last marsupial lions died alone, calling for mates that didn't exist. Megalania retreated to the tropical north where warmth and humidity still allowed large reptiles to function. But even there, prey was disappearing. The giant monitor lizards that had once hunted Diprotodon were reduced to scavenging and cannibalism. The last ones died not from direct human hunting, but from ecosystem collapse. No prey meant no predators. Ganonas held on in small populations around reliable water sources, but their breeding biology doomed them. These giant birds needed specific conditions for successful nesting, conditions that no longer existed reliably anywhere. The last clutches failed year after year until there were only adults, then only old adults, then nothing. Human sites from this period show a dietary transition. Where once there were Diprotodon bones, now there were remains of smaller animals, not by choice, but by necessity. The humans who had learned over millennia to hunt giants were having to relearn survival in a world without them. The skills passed down for 1,000 generations suddenly useless. The very last megafauna might have survived in remote refuges, deep gorges with permanent springs, isolated valleys with unique microclimates. Aboriginal stories hint at encounters with giant animals long after they supposedly went extinct. But these would have been ghosts of populations, genetic dead ends waiting for the inevitable. What's remarkable is how empty the continent became. Ecological roles that megafauna had filled for millions of years went vacant. Nothing evolved to replace Diprotodon as a large grazer. Nothing took Thelacolio's place as an ambush predator. The extinction left holes in the ecosystem that have never been filled. The speed of the final collapse was breathtaking. Radiocarbon dating shows that most megafauna species disappeared within a 5,000-year window. In evolutionary terms, that's instantaneous. Creatures that had survived everything Earth could throw at them for millions of years vanished in what amounted to a geological eye blink. By 35,000 years ago, it was essentially over. A few species limped on in reduced numbers, but the ecosystem that had supported them was gone. The age of Australian giants ended not in some dramatic catastrophe, but in the quiet disappearance of one species after another until only their bones remained. The humans who witnessed this extinction couldn't have understood its magnitude. To them, it was just the old ones' stories becoming memories, then myths. But they had witnessed something unprecedented, the end of a world that had existed since the dinosaurs, and they were both witnesses and participants in its destruction. Stand in the Australian outback today and you're looking at an empty theatre. The stage is still there, the rocks, the sparse vegetation, the endless sky. But the cast is gone. What remains is a pale shadow of what was, like comparing a child's sketch to the Mona Lisa. The Australia we know is the impoverished descendant of something magnificent. Today's largest native land predator is the dingo, weighing maybe 20 kilograms. Prehistoric Australia had Thylacoleo at 160 kilograms. That's like replacing a lion with a house cat. The ecological role of large predator, controlling herbivore populations, creating fear landscapes that shape behavior, recycling nutrients through kills, simply doesn't exist anymore. Modern Australia's largest native herbivore is the red kangaroo at 90 kilograms. Diprotodon weighed 2,800 kilograms. That's not just a size difference, it's a functional difference. Diprotodon shaped landscapes, created paths that became rivers, maintained clearings that became ecosystems. Red kangaroos are lovely, but they don't engineer continents. The vegetation tells the story most clearly. Modern Australia is dominated by fire-adapted plants because nothing else survives. But prehistoric Australia had diverse forests maintained by megafauna browsing. Those giants prevented any single plant species from dominating, created mosaics of different habitats, and recycled nutrients on a scale that made soils rich and diverse. Water patterns changed completely. Megafauna wallows became permanent water sources for smaller animals. Their paths channeled rainfall into predictable streams. Their dung heaps created nutrient hotspots that supported unique plant communities. When they vanished, so did these landscape features. Modern Australia's hydrology is still adjusting to their absence. The nutrient cycle crashed. A single Diprotodon returned literally tons of processed plant matter to the soil annually. Multiply that by thousands of individuals. Add the nutrients from predator kills, and you had a system that kept soils fertile across vast areas. Modern Australia struggles with nutrient-poor soils, partly because the recyclers vanished. Seed dispersal networks collapsed. Many Australian plants evolved to have their seeds dispersed by megafauna. Tough seeds that needed to pass through giant digestive systems, fruits too large for any modern animal to swallow. These plants still exist, producing fruits nothing can eat, waiting for dispersers that will never come. The predator-prey dynamics simplified drastically. Instead of complex webs with multiple predators specializing in different prey, we have simplified chains. Nothing hunts adult kangaroos except humans and dingoes. Nothing fills the ecological role of ambush predator in forests. The chess game of evolution became checkers. Fire regimes went haywire. Megafauna browsing created natural fire breaks, consumed fuel loads, and maintained mosaics of different aged vegetation. Without them, fire became catastrophic rather than regenerative. Modern Australia's fire problems aren't just about climate, they're about missing the ecosystem engineers who manage fuel loads for millions of years. Indigenous Australians adapted remarkably to this emptied landscape, but their Dreamtime stories preserve memories of when it was full. They developed fire stick farming partly to replicate megafauna impacts. They learned to hunt smaller, faster prey because the big, slow prey was gone. Their entire culture adapted to absence. Modern Australians live in this aftermath without realising it. We think the outback is naturally harsh and empty. We accept that Australian wildlife is mostly small and venomous. We don't realise we're looking at a post-apocalyptic landscape where only the weeds of the animal kingdom survived. The extinction cascades continue today. Plants that co-evolved with megafauna decline without their partners. Soil communities that developed under megafauna-driven nutrient cycles degrade. Waterways that existed because of megafauna engineering dry up. We're still watching ecosystems collapse from extinctions that happened 40,000 years ago. What we lost wasn't just species, we lost entire ecological functions, landscape engineering, nutrient cycling, seed dispersal networks, fear landscapes, trophic cascades, the subtle interactions that took millions of years to develop and disappeared in thousands. Modern Australia has unique, wonderful wildlife, but it's wonderful in the way a vandalized masterpiece is still art. You can appreciate what remains while mourning what was destroyed. Every time we marvel at a kangaroo or fear a snake, we're looking at the survivors of an extinction event that stripped away 90% of what made Australia extraordinary. The continent that once supported dragons now struggles to support cattle. That's what we lost. Not just animals, but an entire world. Here's the thing that should keep you awake at night. We're doing it again. The same combination of climate change and human pressure that erased Australia's megafauna is playing out globally, just faster. But this time, we can see it happening. This time, we understand the consequences. This time, we have no excuse. The parallels are terrifying. Climate changing faster than species can adapt? Check. Human pressure fragmenting habitats? Check. Water sources becoming unpredictable? Check. Specialized species disappearing first? Check. We're speedrunning the megafauna extinction, and Australia's prehistoric catastrophe is our preview of coming attractions. But prehistoric Australia also teaches us about resilience. Aboriginal Australians survived the extinction, adapted to the emptied landscape, and created a sustainable culture that lasted 50,000 years. They proved humans can live in balance with whatever environment we're given. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn from them. The Dreamtime stories that preserve megafauna memories also preserve survival strategies. Indigenous fire management, developed in response to extinction-altered landscapes, offers lessons for modern wildfire management. Traditional ecological knowledge, dismissed for centuries, is now recognized as sophisticated landscape management that worked for millennia. Modern rewilding efforts dream of restoring ecosystems, but Australia shows us the challenge. Once ecological functions disappear, they're nearly impossible to restore. You can't just add large herbivores and expect them to recreate Diprotodon's impacts. The relationships took millions of years to develop and can't be rebuilt quickly. The genetic ghosts of megafauna still haunt modern species. Quolls, once prey for thylacoleo, still exhibit anti-predator behaviors for threats that no longer exist. Plants still produce fruits sized for giants. These evolutionary echoes remind us that extinction's impacts last far longer than the species themselves. Climate science uses Australia's prehistoric changes as a model for understanding ecosystem responses. The detailed fossil record of how landscapes responded to drying provides data for predicting future changes. What happened to Australia then is happening to Africa now. The past isn't just history, it's prophecy. The role of humans in the extinction remains contentious but crucial. We weren't the sole cause, but we were the tipping point. That pattern, human pressure turning survivable challenges into extinctions, continues today. Every species balanced on the edge needs only a small push from us to fall. Conservation biology uses megafauna extinction as a cautionary tale. Large-bodied species with slow reproduction remain vulnerable. Specialists face higher risks than generalists. Ecosystem engineers, once lost, leave holes nothing else can fill. These aren't historical curiosities, but active principles guiding protection efforts. The empty niche phenomenon haunts ecologists. Australia proves that when keystone species vanish, ecosystems don't necessarily recover or replace them. They simply become less complex, less stable, less resilient. Modern ecosystems worldwide are showing the same simplification that followed megafauna loss. Indigenous knowledge systems that preserved megafauna memories for 50,000 years offer models for long-term thinking. In a world obsessed with quarterly reports, cultures that plan for centuries and remember for millennia have something to teach. Sustainability isn't just about resources, it's about memory. The psychological impact of living with giants, recorded in Dreamtime stories, reminds us what we've lost globally. No modern child will ever know the awe and terror of sharing landscapes with true giants. We've created a world sized for humans, forgetting that wonder requires things larger than ourselves. Australia's empty landscapes warn us about Earth's future, a world where only small, fast-breeding generalists survive, where ecosystems function but don't flourish, where the word magnificent applies only to history, not reality. It's a survivable future, but an impoverished one. But here's the hope. We know this story now. We understand the mechanisms. We can see the patterns. The first Australians who watched megafauna disappear couldn't stop it because they didn't understand it. We do. The question is whether understanding translates to action. Every species we save today is a Diprotodon that doesn't disappear. Every ecosystem we protect is a thylacoleo that keeps hunting. Every climate impact we prevent is a Megalania that doesn't lose its prey. We can't bring back Australia's giants, but we can prevent creating more ghosts. The lesson of prehistoric Australia isn't just about what we lost, it's about what we're losing. The empty outback stands as a monument to extinction, a preview of Earth's future if we continue today's patterns. But it also stands as proof that humans can adapt, survive, and even thrive after catastrophe. The choice is ours. Repeat history or learn from it. The giants are calling from 40,000 years ago, their bones crying out the same warning: change course or join us. In prehistoric Australia, we glimpse our future. The question is whether we'll use that glimpse to change it. Because this time, we are the giants, and we're writing our own extinction story. The only question is whether it'll have a different ending.